When it comes to in-ring skill, there are few, if any, who are better than Bret Hart. During his career, he managed to build a name for himself as the absolute pinnacle when it came to technique, psychology, and storytelling. So much so that even today, many consider him to be the greatest of all time. So join us today as we take a deep dive into his entire career journey in Excellence of Execution, The Bret Hart Story. Bret Sergeant Hart was born on July 2, 1957 in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, into the legendary Hart family. The Hart clan, of course, was led by Stu, an icon in the Canadian scene and the promoter of Stampede Wrestling for many years by that point. It was expected then that all of his male heirs would enter the business too, and so along with his 7 other brothers, Bret was enveloped into the wrestling industry from a very young age. Of course, stories of them all being trained in the Hart family dungeon, getting stretched out and put through the ringer have entered into industry myth over the years. In fact, so hardcore was much of this training that many of the Hart brothers would also become accomplished amateur wrestlers too. The future Hitman would even find some success with this during his younger years as well, as he went on to win several championships around various Alberta-based tournaments and at one point even looked like he could become an Olympic hopeful. That said, however, he would always keep his eyes set on the world of the pros, as that's where he really wanted to be in the long run. And this began for him in 1976 when he started making appearances for Stampede Wrestling, initially refereeing matches but quickly putting on his boots and fighting for himself. Initially, he partnered with his brother Keith as the two went on to win the Stampede International Tag Team Championships 4 times together. Despite this though, it was clear that Bret had a lot of potential as a singles competitor, and so he would go out on his own before long, eventually winning the British Commonwealth Mid-Heavyweight Championship twice and North American Heavyweight Championship 6 times. With all this talent then, word of him soon spread around the industry, and it became only a matter of time before Vince McMahon, who Stu had a working relationship with at that time, would come calling and try and get Bret onto his roster. And eventually this happened in 1984 when McMahon brought the young Canadian in, initially hoping to give him a cowboy gimmick until the future WWE champion vetoed this, stating instead that he just wanted to wrestle as himself. And himself was all he needed to be, as it turned out, because very quickly, the Hitman, as he had then come to be known, would endear himself to fans as an occasional singles performer and regular tag partner of his real-life brother-in-law Jim Neidhart, the two naming themselves the Hart Foundation. It was also around this time that commentator Gorilla Monsoon christened Bret with the moniker The Excellence of Execution on account of his unparalleled skill in the ring, which, even at this point, was noticeable. And his skills would only get better as time went on, as he got to work with some of the greatest wrestlers in the world now that he was in WWE. He even shared the ring with Andre the Giant in the WrestleMania 2 Battle Royal in a fact that sounds like it should be made up, but isn't. By February 7, 1987, the Hart Foundation were also able to win Tag Team Gold for the first time when they beat the British Bulldogs on an episode of Superstars of Wrestling. And not long after this, they would officially turn babyface for the first time in WWE. Following that, they would lose the tag titles, but Bret was able to bounce back by having his most high-profile match to date when he took on Macho Man Randy Savage on the November 28th episode of Saturday Night's Main Event. Yes, clearly the company could see that they had something special in the Hitman, and they showed this even more when they had him be the first entrant into the inaugural Royal Rumble, lasting a full 25 minutes and 42 seconds before getting eliminated. And this upward momentum only continued as he got a shot at the Honky Tonk Man's Intercontinental title that July, a shot he would be unable to win at the time, but one which would set the stage for where he was going in the future. From there, between 1988 and 1991, Bret would continue to get chances to shine in singles competition, all while the Hart Foundation dominated the tag team division, getting big wins over the likes of the Rougeaus, Rhythm and Blues, and Demolition, the latter of whom they would defeat to win the tag team titles for the second time. By SummerSlam of 1991, though, it was impossible to ignore the fact that Bret was ready to be a full-time singles star. And so after he and Neidhart had disbanded their team a few months prior, the Hitman challenged Mr. Perfect for the Intercontinental Championship at the big summer event, making him tap out to his finisher, the Sharpshooter, after 18 minutes to begin his first reign with the gold. It should come as no surprise then that by that September, he would also win the King of the Ring tournament, an event that was at this time still untelevised, but from there continued to defend the IC title in what was often the best match of the show, fully living up to the legacy set by past champions like Randy Savage and Ricky Steamboat. In January of 1992, he would lose the belt to the Mountie, but this, as it turned out, was only done to set up a big passing of the torch moment between Bret and Rowdy Roddy Piper at WrestleMania 8, as Piper, who in the intervening time had won the Intercontinental strap from the Mountie, did the honors for Hart at the grandest stage of them all, putting him over strong as the two gave audiences one of the best examples of in-ring storytelling the company had ever seen by this point. After that, Bret defended his newly re-won title against Shawn Michaels in WWE's first ever ladder match, a match which had been popular in Stampede Wrestling and one which the Canadian had been trying to get WWE to use for some time. And of course, this match would also be memorable for being the start of the feud that in many ways defined Hart's career, his continued beef with the Heartbreak Kid. This would remain on the back burner for now though, because he had bigger things on his plate as he was set to take on his brother-in-law, the British Bulldog, at SummerSlam 1992, a WWE pay-per-view which, for the first time ever, was being held at Wembley Stadium in London, England. And on that night, in front of what was, at the time, WWE's largest crowd ever, Hart and the Bulldog main evented and absolutely stole the show, putting on a match that many to this day consider to be one of the greatest they've ever seen. Yes, by this point, everyone could see that not only was Bret Hart a fantastic wrestler, but he was arguably the best in the whole world. And so after Hulk Hogan had left the company earlier that year, Vince McMahon, needing a new face to carry things, decided to give the Canadian an opportunity, having him pin Ric Flair to win the WWE title for the first time at a Superstars taping in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan on October 12th of 1992. This was a major moment, of course, because it represented a change in the boss's philosophy, with him choosing not to put the belt on an overly muscular guy, but instead on a relatively small but supremely talented performer like Hart. Now, part of the reason for this was the ongoing steroid trial, but nevertheless, Bret took the opportunity and ran with it, quickly establishing himself as a worthy face in the company as he became a fighting champion, defending against the likes of Shawn Michaels and Razor Ramon before losing the belt to Yokozuna at WrestleMania 9. Of course, anyone who remembers that show will know that it was the one where Hulk Hogan made his return and appeared after the main event to beat Yoko in an impromptu match, winning the WWE title for the 5th time. Allegedly, this was supposed to lead to Hogan passing the torch to Bret as the new face of the company at the subsequent SummerSlam pay-per-view. However, Hogan apparently nixed this before it could happen, claiming Hart wasn't in his league and refusing to put him over. Now, this has never been confirmed by the Hulkster himself, but given his history, we're inclined to believe it happened, and so instead, Bret had to settle for winning the 1993 King of the Ring, the first one that was televised, as he went through the ringer in the one-night tournament, putting on 3 excellent and very different performances against Razor Ramon, Mr. Perfect, and Bam Bam Bigelow, once again proving just how skilled he was in the ring. After that, he started up a long-term feud with Jerry the King Lawler, something that would continue on throughout 1993, and would even branch across to Lawler's own federation, the United States Wrestling Association. And it was here that Bret's younger brother Owen first came into the main event picture too, as he joined forces with the Hitman during his battles with the King. This would lead to the two teaming up more long-term as the brothers began setting their sights on winning tag team gold together. And eventually, after a series of victories, they would get this chance when they took on the Quebecers at the 1994 Royal Rumble, ultimately losing after an injured Bret refused to tag out and the referee was forced to call for a stoppage. This of course angered Owen, so much so that he turned on his brother after the match, kicking his leg out of his leg and starting a feud between the two that would build in intensity over the next couple of months. But that wasn't the end of the night for Bret, because despite his kayfabe injury, he would return to enter the Royal Rumble match later on and would even become the joint winner alongside Lex Luger after both men eliminated each other at the same time. This then set up 2 major programs for the Hitman at WrestleMania 10, one personal as he was set to take on his brother, and the other business as both he and Luger would get individual shots at Yokozuna and the WWE title. That night on March 20th, 1994, the Hart brothers would kick things off by having one of the best pure wrestling matches ever seen either inside or outside of a WWE ring. To the shock of many, though, it would be Owen who would get the surprise win in the end, something which made far more sense by the time the event was over. After that, Bret had one more mountain to climb as he challenged Yokozuna for the WWE title in the main event, eventually beating him to regain his belt as the locker room of babyfaces came out to the ring and hoisted him up on their shoulders while a rapturous Madison Square Garden crowd cheered him on. There was one person who didn't take part in that celebration though, because Owen could be seen stood in the entranceway, watching his brother and knowing that he had pinned him, and as such was next in line for that title. That match would come at August 29, 1994's SummerSlam, as the Hart family feud reached its peak when the two brothers faced off inside a steel cage while their entire family watched from ringside. Unfortunately though, despite giving him the belt, it seems WWE never felt comfortable fully pushing him as their face, as he rarely got a chance to main event during this title run, often playing second fiddle to the likes of The Undertaker. When he eventually lost the belt to Bob Backlund at that November Survivor Series then, many feared that the company had lost faith in him as a draw and would begin easing him back down the card. Sadly, this is what happened, sort of. While he was still pushed as a big star, Bret would spend the vast majority of 1995 being stuck in middling mid-card feuds with the likes of Jean-Pierre Lafitte and Isaac Yankem, as Vince McMahon's attention was diverted towards his new favorite toy, Diesel. It wouldn't be until November Survivor Series, in fact, that Vince finally realized fans didn't want Diesel but wanted the Hitman instead, and so he put the belt back on him. After that, Hart carried the title into the new year, but even at this point, McMahon already had one eye on his next big thing as he was preparing to have his champion face Shawn Michaels at the upcoming WrestleMania 12. This match would end up being the now iconic Iron Man match, one which, depending on who you ask, might be either the best or the most overrated WrestleMania match ever. Either way, it's undeniable that both men would put on an incredible athletic performance that night as they went for a full hour without anyone being able to score a single fall. It would take a sudden death overtime, in fact, for a winner to finally be decided, something that would happen when HBK was able to hit his opponent with 2 super kicks to realize his boyhood dream of becoming WWE Champion. After that, the plan was for Bret to take some time off and try his hand out at acting as, burnt out with WWE's brutal road schedule, he had gotten himself a role in the TV series Lonesome Dove, and had hoped that this might serve as a nice way of recharging his batteries once again. During this time, however, the on-screen heat between Bret and Shawn Michaels began to spill over into real life, as Bret allegedly felt disrespected by HBK's calls for him to get out of his ring after their match, something which would only simmer in the months that followed. But regardless of that, by November of 1996, Hart was now feeling charged up again and ready to return to the ring. At this point though, he almost ended up moving over to WCW instead after they had presented him with a very lucrative contract. Bret, loyal to Vince however, decided to stick with WWE and was rewarded for this by being given a 20-year, multi-million-dollar contract. But when he did return to a WWE ring, he quickly found that things had changed and that the days of his paragon of virtue babyface antics were becoming passé. This was emphasized further as he got into a feud with Stone Cold Steve Austin, the two facing off at the 1996 Survivor Series and then continuing to beef well into the new year as fans started to turn on the Hitman and embrace the villainous Rattlesnake more and more. This led to them having a final showdown at WrestleMania 13, a match which we've talked about in detail over on our Steve Austin video, but to put it lightly, is probably the greatest wrestling match ever. And it was on that night that Hart finally turned heel, at least to American fans. Yes, this was the beginning of a truly unique story where the Hitman remained babyface in his home country of Canada while being a heel south of the border, starting off something of a company war between the two nations where, depending on the country any given show was taking place in, the heel-face dynamic would switch. And this was never more apparent than at the July 6, 1997 Canadian Stampede show where, in front of their own countrymen, the newly reformed Hart Foundation, which by then included Bret, Owen, the British Bulldog, Jim Neidhart, and Brian Pillman, came out to one of the loudest ovations you're ever likely to hear. Of course, while this story was one of the best things going in WWE during 1997, it hadn't always been the plan, as Hart was initially supposed to get his rematch with Shawn Michaels at WrestleMania 13, with HBK returning the favor from the year prior and putting him over. Michaels, however, notorious for his prima donna attitude at this time, allegedly refused to lose to Bret and instead vacated the belt after suffering a knee injury which many, the Hitman included, believed to be faked or at least embellished so that he didn't have to lose it in the ring. By now, the real-life heat between these two men had grown so severe that later that year, they even got involved in a real fistfight backstage and had to be separated as Vince McMahon desperately tried to get his performers under control. And this certainly wasn't helped when Shawn would do things like throw accusations of the Hitman cheating on his wife out on live TV. Eventually, though, things were able to get calmed down enough to the point where they could book a match between them at the 1997 Survivor Series. However, by this point, there was an even bigger problem at play. Again, as we've said in our Shawn Michaels video, the Montreal Screwjob could fill up an entire video in itself, but for reference here, the basic notes are that Vince could no longer pay for Bret's 20-year contract given the company's financial woes at the time, and so gave him permission to negotiate with WCW. What he'd forgotten to do before that, however, was to take the title off of him, and so now his contract was running out, and he realized he had to have Hart visually lose on TV, otherwise risk him going to the competition as the champion in the fans' eyes. The initial solution was that Bret was booked to lose to Shawn that night at the Survivor Series, but given the heat between the two men, the Hitman refused, this leading to McMahon and a select few others scheming to have it look like he had tapped out towards the end of the match, even though he hadn't, taking the belt from him in a moment that left Hart feeling hugely disrespected given his years of loyalty to the company. Furious then, after he realized what had happened to him, he trashed the ringside area and went on to punch Vince backstage, leaving him with a black eye, much of which was captured in the documentary Wrestling with Shadows, which, coincidentally, was being filmed at this time. After that, he vowed to never have anything to do with WWE again as he jumped ship to Ted Turner's Southern Wrestling promotion. Unfortunately, though, it would quickly become apparent that WCW had no idea what to do with their newest acquisition, and so after a completely botched first couple of years there, which saw him do little of note, he would eventually win the WCW title on December 7, 1999, only to vacate it a couple of weeks later after a botched superkick from Bill Goldberg left him with a severe concussion. After that, rather than giving him time to fully recover, WCW put him back into the ring in a hardcore match with Terry Funk, with him suffering another concussion there, this finally being the one to end his career as he would develop post-concussion syndrome soon thereafter. And so, just like that, the storied in-ring career of Bret "Hitman" Hart had come to an end. Sadly, in the years that followed, things would get even worse as the Hart family were torn apart with infighting after the tragic death of Owen in a stunt gone wrong at 1999's WWE Over the Edge pay-per-view. 2 years after that, and Bret would also suffer a stroke, leaving him temporarily in a wheelchair. Thankfully, though, time heals all wounds, and as the years progressed, his health improved, and he finally mended fences with WWE following the events of both the Montreal Screwjob and the death of his brother. In 2006, he was even inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame, and in 2009, he would bury the hatchet with Shawn Michaels after the two had a memorable in-ring segment together on an episode of Raw. Following this, he got a chance to close the door on Montreal forever as he and Vince McMahon had a match together at WrestleMania 26, one which, given the incredibly limited nature of what Hart could do by that point, unfortunately ended up stinking out the joint but nevertheless allowed the Hitman to finally put things behind him. Since then, he's made occasional appearances on WWE TV, at one point even briefly winning the United States title from The Miz. As well as that, he served as temporary manager for his niece Natalya while she was in NXT, and in 2019 became a two-time Hall of Famer after both he and Jim Neidhart were inducted for their tag team efforts as the Hart Foundation. Yes, thankfully it looks like the Hitman can now be at peace with how things ended during his career and instead look back across the many, many high points he had, because, as we said at the start of this video, there are few, if any, who could match up to him in the ring. Just watch pretty much any of his matches, because each one remains a masterclass in how to be the best there is, the best there was, and the best there ever will be.